Good evening. I must start by making some confessions. First of all, I have had an Hexenschuss, so I am now looking my full age. I am 67 and I normally feel like I'm 40. Now I feel like I'm 87. So if I suddenly do like this, it is because of my back. I'm taken to a doctor afterwards. So point one, I'm normally not like this. Secondly, I am going to show a number of slides. Those slides I only show you in order to impress you. You don't have to look at the slides. You don't even have to understand the slides. You just listen to what I am saying. You know, what is important will be conveyed through my voice, you know, so you don't have to worry about the slides. On the other hand, all the slides are there in order to show that there is very much more behind what I'm saying than my simple words. So there is a lot of work behind the relatively pedagogic and clear message that I'm going to carry. 40 years ago, my friends and I wrote a book called The Limits to Growth. This book contained 12 different pictures of the future from 1970 to the year 2100, 130 years into the future. 6 of those futures were negative futures, where the world did not do very well in the 21st century. 6 of those futures were more or less positive futures, where there were different degrees of sustainability achieved during the 21st century. At the time, 40 years ago, we did not know enough. There was not enough data available to tell which of the 12 futures was the most likely. So the main message of the Limits to Growth book was actually quite simple. It said, point one, the world is small compared to the population and the world economy. We don't know really how small, but it is small. And secondly, we said that the systems of governance that we have chosen for guiding global society, capitalism and democracy, you know, being the prime leaders, have one common weakness. They're so slow in the reaction that most likely the global population and the global economy is going to overshoot the sustainable carrying capacity of the globe. So, 2 messages: the world is small and overshoot is likely because of slow societal reactions to the challenge. Today, we know much more. We're 40 years down the line and we know very much more. First of all, we know that we have overshot, that the systems of governance did not manage to stop greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, we emit into the atmosphere twice as much CO2 every year as is being absorbed by the world's oceans and forests. So what we know is that the systems of governance have allowed overshot, and this has happened in spite of the fact that it is simple to do something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from global society, and it does not cost a lot. It costs of the order of 1 to 2% of the GDP. So the question I asked a year ago is, here we are, in overshoot, and I have only 20 more years to live. You know, what will those next years look like? I've been worried about the world future for 40 years, working for sustainable development. It hasn't worked. The world is more unsustainable now than it was when I started doing this 40 years ago. And so, what will the next 40 years be like? It's in this book called 2052. And this book is an interesting combination of hard data, computer models, intuition, life experience. I worked all over the place for 40 years, and my friends who have joined me in doing this book has a lot of practical knowledge. So this is a combination of hard fact and experience. We have the great advantage at this point in time that we know very much more than in 1972, and consequently I took the chance now to make a forecast as opposed to a scenario analysis. So here is one future. This is the future I believe will happen over the next 40 years. I did this because I'm curious myself about what the rest of my life is going to be like. I also did it, of course, in order to try to kick democracy into action. You know, to try to see if it wouldn't be possible one final time to get, you know, humanity to do something about this obvious problem that is so easily solvable if we want to do so. And notice that all the data is available at the website called www.2052.info. There you can look at all the detail if you want to. The world, I make the forecast of the world by splitting the world into 5 regions: China, the US, China, the other industrial world, the 14 biggest emerging economies, and the rest of the world, the 120 most poor countries, the poorest country in the world. I make assumptions that technology is going to develop more or less at the same percentage rate as it has over the last 40 years, which is what I think it will. I do not think there will be great changes in the attitudes and the values of people, so I presume that society is going to continue the idiotic search for higher incomes, you know, forever. And I think there is only one very different thing I think will happen over the next 40 years that did not happen over the last 40 years. There will be, society will be meeting a large number of new problems of depletion and pollution and climate change, social inequity, etc., etc. These problems will come like a wall towards global society, and society will solve those problems by spending money on them. So a good example, the United States of America does not spend a lot of money avoiding climate change, but once the hurricane hit New Orleans, they have to spend the money rebuilding New Orleans. And that's one of the basic assumptions here. I do think that society is going to respond to challenges by increasing investments, basically, reducing the consumption part of the economy and rather putting capital and labor into repair work. The core of my forecast is simple. I start with making a population forecast, and you will see that, so now you can, the ones who like to look at the graphs, the left-hand part is history, the shaded one, and the right part is my forecast from 2010 to 2050. And there are various scales indicated, always 0 at the bottom. And you could look at the red line if you want to look at one line. And that's normally the most important one. On this one, the important thing is that I believe that the world, I forecast that the world population will peak already in 2040. It will peak at roughly 8 billion people. This is, no, this is much earlier than most people think. The reason why I make this forecast is that I think that fertility is going to sink much faster than most people think. In the rich world, women will continue to choose a job rather than having children, and in the poor world, urbanization reduces the family size rather dramatically. It makes sense to have a lot of kids in the countryside. It does not make sense to have children in the urban areas. Fertility will fall, and as a consequence, we will only reach 8 billion people, and then the population will fall. If I want to, then I want to make a forecast of the world economy. You know, how big will the world's gross domestic product be over the next 40 years? My forecast is one where GDP growth will continue, but at much lower rates than over the last 40 years. The reason for this is that the mature economies are increasingly mature, meaning that, that they have most of the workforce now in the services and social care end of the spectrum, it is much more difficult to increase labor productivity in that end than it is in agriculture, manufacturing, office work, etc. So as a consequence, in the United States and Europe, which are the most mature economies, we will see that there is hardly any economic growth per person in the coming 40 years. And when the labor force then starts to decline, the total GDP will also in the end start declining. Of course, there are still poor parts of the world, China, emerging economies, and the rest of the world that will grow, has the potential to grow rather fast over the next 40 years. Catching up with the industrial world. Some will, China, others will not, the poor world in my forecast. So interestingly, I expect the world economy to only be twice, 2.2 times as big in 2050 as it is in 2010. An increasing fraction of this GDP will be investment. You know, it will be the type of repair work or the extra costs necessary in order to get out ores with a lower content of the desired metal, etc. You see how the investment share increases here, and you see how consumption, that part of the economic output that is used for personal consumption, actually levels off, meaning that the world will actually not consume very much more than it does in 2040 in my forecast, because of all the problems that one needs to solve with the workforce and with the capital. Once I know the GDP, it's a simple affair to forecast the energy use. You just use the energy efficiency, you know, the energy use per GDP, which is the green line, which has come down very nicely over the last 40 years, and which I think will continue forwards, downwards over the next 40 years. And you see, as a consequence, the world consumption of energy will reach a peak already in 2040. And once you have the, okay, here is the composition of my forecast. You see the renewable energy use, the orange line, increasing dramatically during this period, but only reaching 40% of total energy use in 2050, meaning that we will still be 60% fossil in 2050. And then you see gas use growing rather fast, coal growing relatively fast, oil use being more or less stable over the next 20 years. This oil use is, of course, a combination of conventional oil, which has already peaked, and all the unconventional oil, which is what we are stupidly going to use, you know, over the next 20 years. Nuclear energy, as you see, is basically stable and then going down. This is essentially shifting the reactors from the United States of America and Europe to China and the East, except for the French. And then once you know the energy composition, you can very quickly calculate what will be the CO2 emissions of the future. And you see that my forecast is that humanity will not reduce emissions by 50 to 80% in 2050, which is, of course, the commonly agreed goal. They will reduce by 0. You know, the emissions in 2050 will be exactly as high as they are today. There will be a difference. Today, CO2 emissions per year are going up. They will reach a peak in 2030, and in 2050, they will be 20 years into a decline. But all of that CO2 being emitted during the next 50 years will lead to a temperature which increases from 0.8 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial time at this time to +2 degrees in 2050, and moving briskly upwards to some 3 degrees centigrade in 2080. This is enough to create climate problems already before 2050, and perhaps what is this called, self-reinforcing climate change in the second half of this century. This is basically all math, you know, just multiply things and you get this type of forecast. What is important is that this was the global average. Of course, the development in the various regions will be very different, and just in order to highlight, here is average after-tax disposable income per person in the various regions. And you see at the top line, which is the American purchasing power, which is of course the highest in the world, which in my book basically goes down by 10 or 15% over the next 40 years. This is because the United States is the most mature economy on the surface of the earth, but it is also because they have a system of governance which is such that they are unable to make the types of decisions that are necessary in order to get the economy growing. And thirdly, that they owe the Chinese a lot of money, which they need to repay in one way or the other, which is another restructuring of the economy, which they will be hard put to do. You see the rest of the industrial world, Europe and Japan and Australia, more or less stable over this period, meaning that this is a consequence of the same tendency towards maturation of the economy. We have a slightly better decision system than the Americans, although ours is not perfect. You know, we're doing a little better, and we don't start with this huge debt to the rest of the world. Then you look at the red line and you see China is doing very well in this scenario. You know, they're essentially doubling their per capita income in the period. This is because the Chinese have decided to do so, and they are able to do so. You know, they have the decision system in place, which is actually capable of passing rather quickly, you know, the types of decisions that are necessary in order to facilitate this growth. And of course, the Communist Party is backed by a very solid majority of the Chinese population, who is of course only interested in one thing: getting rich as fast as possible. Then there is a tiny minority who would like to say what they think rather than getting rich as fast as possible. But this is really a minority in China. So I think this is a stable regime that is actually going to produce a very high growth rate. So the summary of my forecast is basically that we will see in the middle of this century a much smaller global economy than most people think. Fewer people, less GDP. This, of course, means more poverty in 2050 than most people think. You know, the poor world will still be poor, and the poor in the rich world will also be poor. So, one downside is the fact that we will have slow growth, and the second downside is, of course, that this will lead to more poverty. The advantage of this is, of course, that the ecological footprint of this smaller world economy will be smaller. So the resource use will be lower, the pollution output will be lower, the food demand will be lower, and so I don't see any resource constraints. So here I disagree with most analysts who, of course, are looking at shortages of absolutely everything. I don't think there will be. There will, of course, not be. So there will be, for instance, enough food to satisfy demand. This doesn't mean that there will be enough food to satisfy needs. You know, there will be a lot of starvation in 2050, but that is for the old reason that the poor cannot pay the price for food necessary in order to entice Brazilians, Russians, and Ukrainians to put in operation, you know, the surplus agricultural capacity that exists in these countries. So we will, on the way, see increasing number of climate incidents or events, which we will then try to do something about, but always after the fact rather than doing it up front. The natural world largely will disappear. You know, we will largely cut those trees that exist and bleach those coral reefs that exist, so largely we will only have untouched nature in the national parks at the end of this period. So in short, this is a fairly sad story. You know, the world economy will slow down. It will not slow down because we decide to slow it down. It will slow down because we don't manage to keep it growing. And that has, of course, the positive benefit that we will not bang into the resource constraints as hard as one would otherwise have done. But the slowdown is not fast enough to avoid climate crisis. So this forecast of mine actually resembles very much scenario number 2 from 1972, the one that was called the pollution crisis, you know, where actually world expansion was stopped by persistent pollutants, and it looks as if CO2 is going to be that persistent pollutant. This is bitter to me. I think this is a very, very, very sad forecast, because it is totally unnecessary. We know from multiple analysis, and most famously perhaps by the Stern analysis, that the technologies exist to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 80% by 2050. It doesn't cost a lot. There is an investment period up front, 10 to 20 years, where we need to put money into this, but not a whole lot. And so basically all we need to do in order to solve the problem is to shift 1 to 2% of the workforce and 1 to 2% of the capital of the world from dirty activity to clean activity. So instead of producing fossil cars, we need to produce electric cars. Instead of building coal-fired utilities, we need to build windmills. Instead of laying gas pipeline, we need to hang copper wire to distribute electricity. So it's a shift in the structure of the economy that is necessary. This would be easily done if the new things were cheaper, more profitable than the old things, but they aren't. And so, hence the capitalist system is not going to do this reallocation of capital. It's going to continue to put the money where profits are highest. Then you could have hoped that democracy would be smart enough to pass the regulation that would actually force capitalist flows into the right direction, and I don't think they will. And the reason is that democratic society is very negative to higher taxes and to more expensive gasoline and more expensive electric power, so you really have a hard time getting the regulations passed that would then impact on capitalist society. What needs to be done? Well, this is democratic decision-making, which has the other disadvantage that it takes time. We will probably agree on a UN climate agreement, some 30 years after it was needed. What should be done globally? Very simple. We need to slow population growth even further. And so having fewer children, particularly in the rich world, is important. My daughter is between 20 and 40 times as dangerous as an Indian daughter. Her consumption, my daughter's consumption is of course much higher than any Indian would ever get close to. So it's in the rich world that the one-child family needs to be implemented. Then we need to reduce the footprint further, and the simplest way to do this is of course to ban fossil fuels. And again, first in the rich world. We are using most of this stuff, and we can afford. Thirdly, if we want to help the poor, I think the best way to help the poor would be for us to build a climate-friendly energy system in the poor world. So we would stop using development aid for all the purposes we're currently supporting, and rather start building the windmills and the solar panels and the hydropower plants and the biomass treatment things in the third world for the third world. Fourthly, we need in some way or the other to convince the voter to start to be in favor of expensive solutions. That he wants or she is willing to actually pay a little bit more now than the cheapest price in order to make a better life for our grandchildren. And I think that supranational institutions is the least improbable solution to this. I don't think this will happen, but it should happen. And then finally, instead of insisting on increasing the income, one should rather shift societal goal into increasing societal well-being. Sorry, Jesus Christ. Oof, this is my back. We should rather try to go for systematic increase in well-being, rather than systematic increase in income. I have translated this list for pioneer regions. And I'm not just saying what you already know. I did, of course, not know the great work that you guys are doing when I wrote my talk. And so I have heard some of the presentations, and I see that most of these things are already being done, and I congratulate you on that. So basically, when you translate my general global list to pioneer regions in Austria. I add only one thing which I think is important. You should start by being in favor of even smaller families than you have, and an optimal degree of centralization. You know, people living in lumps emit much less CO2 per person year than people living in the rural areas. And this is a sad fact. It's politically totally unacceptable to mention in my country. I'm sure it is totally unacceptable in your country. But clearly, you know, one of the simplest ways to reduce greenhouse gas emission is to concentrate the population in optimal manners. The second thing is what you are doing very nicely, increasing energy efficiency and increasing the fraction of the energy that comes from renewable sources, both for heat and electricity. Thirdly, you know, the things that needs to be done are the totally obvious and well-known things to you. It's to do something about your car, about your house, and about air travel. You know, so basically buy a car which uses less fuel and then spend money on insulating your home. And then instead of going on 2 air trips per year, you know, somewhere to the Canary Islands or wherever, you know, go once and stay twice as long. That's an easy way to reduce by 50% your air emissions. This you can do as an individual if you want to be voluntary and move ahead and be a good example. I recommend that one does it collectively. It's much more efficient to do this through legislation and regulation. And then finally, remember that the challenge is essentially political. You know, it is not a technological challenge, it's not really an economic challenge. It is in rich societies like yours and mine, a question of convincing the voter that it is a good idea to actually go for wise policy, even if that is slightly more expensive than the cheapest solution. Finally, I don't like the future I describe. That's needless to say. If I were king, I would have run the world in a totally different manner than the way in which the world will be run over the next 40 years. The only hope here is that my numbers, my forecast is a cliffhanger in the sense that it does not take a lot of extraordinary effort in order to make a much, much better world in the future. And I certainly hope that that extraordinary effort is actually going to come forth and make my forecast be wrong. That's, of course, my warmest dream. And it's, of course, clear that the Klima und Energiemodel, what you call them, Regionen, you know, are really already doing this. You know, you're a great example of the extraordinary type of effort which hopefully will make my forecast wrong. Thank you.